With a personal fortune of over $35 billion, Pablo Escobar was the richest criminal who ever lived. Through bribes, kidnapping and murder, his Medellín Cartel dominated Colombia's drug trade for over 17 years, killing more than 4,000 people. But how did a boy born into poverty with dreams of becoming president end up running one of the world's most notorious cartels and have more money and resources than the country that was desperately trying to bring him to justice? This is the unparalleled tale of ambition, corruption and ruthlessness that took a boy from the slums and made him one of history's most infamous and feared criminals. Pablo Emilio Escobar Guevara was born on the 1st of December 1949 in the vibrant city of Medellín, surrounded by the natural beauty of the Andes Mountains. The third of 7 children, his childhood would be filled with poverty and violence that would shape his future in unimaginable ways. His father, Jesus, was a hard-working farmer and strict disciplinarian who instilled a strong sense of discipline and work ethic in the young Pablo from an early age. His mother, Hermilda, a school teacher, was a loving and nurturing presence who supported her son unconditionally. But despite his family's best efforts, they struggled to make ends meet, and it wasn't uncommon for them to go to bed on empty stomachs. They lived in one of Medellín's roughest neighborhoods, plagued by poverty, violence, and with limited opportunities. In spite of this, he was a diligent student and showed early signs of ambition and charisma, captivating those around him with his magnetic personality. His parents wanted him to become a lawyer, but Pablo had his eyes set on government and dreamed of one day becoming president of Colombia. And by all accounts, he was smart enough to do it. He had a thirst for knowledge and was a natural leader, but his family couldn't afford to pay for his schooling. And so, in 1966, at the age of 16, he was forced to drop out of education. And this one act would change the course of his life forever. Without the money to attend college, Pablo would have to find another path to success. And the truth was, he'd grown sick and tired of studying anyway, and was more interested in trying to make some money. He set up a bicycle rental company by refurbishing broken and abandoned bikes, but it was a lot of effort for very little reward. So Pablo moved on to more lucrative ventures. Medellín may have been a poor city, but it had a thriving criminal underworld, one where a smart boy like him could easily earn some money. With the help of his cousin Gustavo, Pablo began stealing tires, and then cars, and eventually graduated to kidnapping. And this turned into a very profitable enterprise for the pair, and only helped grow their reputation for violence. That was until the kidnapping of Diego Echeverria, a widely disliked industrialist. The family agreed to pay the $50,000 ransom, but after receiving the payment, instead of letting Diego go, Pablo had the businessman beaten and strangled before dumping his body in a ditch. Despite the horrific nature of the crime, the murder made Escobar hugely popular with the poor working class of Medellín, who saw the killing as a form of social justice in a fight for equality. And so was born the legend of Pablo Escobar as a champion for the people. By now, his criminal endeavours were proving to be highly profitable, but even though he was making more money than ever, it wasn't enough for Pablo. But fortunately, he would soon discover a product so profitable that his wealth would exceed even his wildest dreams. By 1971, Pablo's crimes had made him tens of thousands of dollars, a fortune for the son of a farmer. He and Gustavo now had a small gang of thugs working for them, and Pablo was both a feared criminal and a hero to the people of Medellín. But he was always on the lookout to make more money. As a part of its protectionist economic policies, Colombia imposed huge import taxes on certain goods like designer clothing, electronics, and tobacco and alcohol. As a result, smugglers could earn huge profits by travelling to neighbouring countries where they could buy these items at cost and then sell them for a huge markup back in Colombia. Pablo learned the best routes to travel, how to avoid checkpoints and bribe officials, and Escobar was a natural at it. And it wasn't long before he was making regular trips to Panama and back with shipments worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. And to ensure their safe arrival, Pablo developed a system known as plata o plomo, silver or lead. When his trucks were stopped at checkpoints, Pablo would offer the soldiers two options, a bribe or a bullet. And given the choice, most took the bribe. For 3 years, Escobar travelled these routes, developing contacts. And by the time he was 22, Pablo was almost a millionaire. But he was never satisfied, and was always on the lookout to make even more money. And there was a fledgling industry in need of a man of his talents. Driven by disco culture, the US demand for cocaine had been steadily rising for years. And Escobar saw an opportunity to capitalise on this lucrative market. Using the same routes that he had established with his trucks, Escobar travelled to Ecuador, where he bought 5 kilograms of cocaine paste for a few $1,000s and smuggled it back to Colombia. Once in Medellín, he processed it into cocaine and sold it to Fabio Restrepo, a local cocaine kingpin, for $100,000. With this deal, Pablo had made more money in one go than he had ever made before. Cocaine may have carried a greater risk, but the profits were simply too good to ignore. Pablo Escobar was now in the narco-trafficking business, and he decided to dedicate all of his time and energy to it. Right from the start, Escobar recognized the immense potential of the growing cocaine market. But as he saw it, there were just far too many people involved. The farmers who grew the plants harvested and sold the leaves to a number of small labs dotted around the country that processed the cocaine before selling it on to local distributors, who then smuggled it into the States. As a result, production was slow and supply was unable to meet demand, so the business could never reach its full potential. Within 2 months of their initial deal, Restrepo was murdered, and even though Escobar claimed to have nothing to do with it, afterwards, all of Restrepo's men were informed that they now worked for Pablo Escobar. He then gathered the other local distributors, Carlos Lida, the Ochoa brothers, and Jose Gotcha, and convinced them to unite their resources, networks, and expertise to formally establish the Medellín Cartel, with Escobar at the head of the organization. By 1976, though still in its infancy, the cocaine trade was booming. By taking advantage of the lax security and their connection, Pablo was able to ship large amounts of cocaine directly into the States with relative ease. He was still very hands-on and would often help smuggle the powder into Ecuador himself. But this decision would turn out to be a disastrous mistake. That it was on one such run that he and 4 of his men were arrested at a checkpoint after agents from the Colombian Security Service discovered 39 kilograms of cocaine hidden in the spare tire of their truck. But Pablo, using his connections and influence, was eventually able to bribe the judge and avoid any prison time. A year later, the 2 agents that arrested him would be assassinated. He may have escaped justice, but this encounter would come back to haunt Escobar. Within a few years, millions of dollars were pouring in, and Pablo started to use the money to take control of every step of the cocaine production line. He travelled to Panama, Bolivia and Peru, buying up all the farms and labs he could, bringing them under the control of the Medellín Cartel. He also bought a fleet of planes and paid millions in bribes in every country to ensure the authorities would look the other way. Police, judges and politicians, they were all on his payroll, and anyone who wouldn't take the bribe or got in his way was murdered by his loyal army of sicarios. By the end of 1978, the Medellín Cartel had transported over 19,000 kilograms of cocaine to the United States, generating a profit of over $1 billion. Pablo had finally managed to achieve the level of wealth and power that he always wanted, and he now intended to spend his money on following his dreams. By 1980, the Medellín Cartel dominated the cocaine industry, accounting for 80% of worldwide production. Pablo controlled every step of the production process and was sending 80 tons of powder a month to the US alone. His delivery fleet had ballooned to 142 planes, 20 helicopters, 32 yachts, and even 2 submarines. Pablo's product was everywhere. Cash deposits held in Colombian banks had doubled in just a couple of years. High-end restaurants and bustling nightclubs had popped up across Medellín, catering to the thousands of men the Medellín Cartel employed to maintain the massive operation. He now also had an army of sicarios who wouldn't hesitate to carry out his orders. There were many other drug smugglers in Colombia, but Escobar was the undisputed king of cocaine, making over $420 million a week. And this was a real problem. It was all in cash, and they had run out of places to put it. The cartel was spending over $2,500 a month on rubber bands. Unable to place so much money in traditional banks without raising suspicion, Escobar had resorted to storing it in basements, warehouses, and even burying it in fields. And as a result, they were losing almost 10% a year, as it was being eaten by rats, destroyed by the elements, or simply lost. Pablo had more money than he knew what to do with, and no choice but to spend as much of it as he could. He already owned everything a man in his 20s could ever want. Multiple mansions, garages full of sports cars, helicopters, private jets. He even had his own zoo filled with exotic animals. There was only one thing left to achieve: his childhood dream of becoming president. Pablo poured millions into cultivating his public image as a man of the people. He gave away an enormous amount to charity, building homes for the poor, schools and hospitals, roads, power lines, and even soccer fields. Escobar was gradually becoming a public figure, and when asked about how he earned such a vast fortune, he said that it came from the bicycle rental company he founded when he was 16. Escobar's philanthropy made him extremely popular amongst the poor working class. He had done more for them in a few years than the government ever had. And so, in 1982, at the peak of his power and popularity, Escobar, the world's most powerful and feared drug lord, ran for Congress. He stood as a substitute for Darío Ortega, a popular and established politician who was running for the congressman of Medellín. Under the Colombian system, voters elected a representative and a substitute, who is allowed full privileges of the office and sits in when the primary delegate is unable to attend Congress. Ortega and Pablo ran together, and with Pablo financing the campaign, they won by a landslide. Then, immediately after the election, Ortega stepped down, and Pablo automatically became the congressman of Medellín. He was now on the first step to political legitimacy and one closer to president. The people may have loved him, but the established Colombian ruling class, the lawmakers and career politicians, saw him for what he truly was, a ruthless and violent criminal at the head of a murderous organisation. On August the 16th, 1983, Pablo travelled to Bogotá to attend a session of Congress for the first time. But within minutes of taking his seat, the Minister of Justice, Rodrigo Lara, made Escobar the focus of the room when he took the stand and publicly denounced him. Lara revealed shocking evidence about the extent of Escobar's crimes. He accused him of using his drug money to finance his political campaign, influence politicians and government officials, and then criticised the Colombian government for its lack of action. Over the next few weeks, the papers were filled with stories exposing him as a drug lord. And on the front of every newspaper was Pablo's mugshot taken on his arrest years earlier. The Colombian government had no choice but to focus all its efforts on Pablo Escobar's arrest. Escobar's dream of becoming president was over, and he resigned from Congress. But Lara had no intention of stopping. He started seizing Pablo's assets, including 250 planes, and began a criminal investigation against him. And these actions would cost him dearly. In 1984, Justice Minister Lara was on his way to a meeting when a motorcycle carrying two of Pablo's sicarios pulled up beside him and opened fire. Lara was killed instantly, and Pablo Escobar had just declared war on the Colombian government. For years, US President Ronald Reagan had been lobbying the Colombian government to extradite their drug lords to America for trial. But Colombian President Belisario Betanca had always refused to cooperate. Now, however, the rules had changed. He declared Pablo Escobar and the Medellín Cartel public enemy number one, and signed a bill that not only gave the police sweeping new powers, but also allowed for their extradition to America. The DEA, who had been watching from the sidelines for years, now had the full cooperation of the Colombian government. It was all-out war on the cartels. Within a few days, their bank accounts were frozen, hundreds were arrested, and assets across the country were seized, including Hacienda Nápoles, Pablo's home and the jewel in his real estate empire. Escobar had no choice but to flee the country. For Pablo, extradition was worse than death. In Colombia, nothing was out of his reach. If he was captured and sent to prison, his wealth and influence could bribe any warden to ensure his sentence was served in luxury. But in America, he would have just been treated like any other inmate. But unlike a few years earlier, when his money ensured that he was welcome anywhere, this time no one wanted to take in the world's most hunted drug lord, and so as soon as his presence was discovered, he was forced to move on. In 1985, in an attempt to destroy evidence against him and convince the Colombian government to revoke extradition, he paid more than $1 million to a feared guerrilla group known as M19 to storm the country's Supreme Court, the Palace of Justice, killing half of the country's Supreme Court justices. But this only strengthened Betanca's resolve, and he vowed to bring the cartels to justice. Against overwhelming odds, Pablo decided to do something that he had never done before: negotiate. He, the Ochoa brothers, Jose Gacha, and Carlos Leda wrote a letter to Benecor and the Colombian government. They pledged to dissolve the Medellín Cartel, destroy all the farms and labs under their control, and invest their huge wealth back into Colombia. In return, they asked for immunity. And when Benecor refused, they even offered to pay off Colombia's national debt. But under pressure from the US, the deal was again refused. Unbeknownst to Pablo, the CIA had managed to photograph him helping to load one of his planes with cocaine in Nicaragua. The photos quickly found their way to President Reagan, who used them to lobby Congress to pass the Anti-Drugs Abuse Act, which allocated an additional $1.7 billion to fund the war on drugs. The fight against Pablo now had a massive war chest. To make matters worse, his absence had made him look vulnerable to his enemies, and sensing a weakness, Pablo's father was kidnapped. Escobar was furious. He may have been on the run, but he was no less dangerous, and with one order, his sicarios swept across Medellín, killing anyone suspected of being a kidnapper. Within a few days, hundreds were murdered, and his father was soon released. But this was a wake-up call for Escobar. It was only a matter of time before the US made its move, and there was nowhere for him to hide. He needed to show everyone that he was still in control, and so he returned to the one place he felt safe, Medellín. Escobar had hundreds of mansions across the city, each with its own network of secret tunnels and escape rooms, the architects of which Pablo had killed. Their secrets. With an army of informants helping him, Pablo travelled from villa to villa, narrowly evading capture, but always one step ahead. With the fear of his arrest constantly hanging over his head, Pablo went on the offensive. Determined to change the government's policy, he targeted any judges who supported extradition, killing more than 30. But this was only the beginning. Pablo put bounties on the heads of police. Judges had to hide their faces in court to avoid retaliation. And going back to his old tricks, he had the family of politicians kidnapped. For years, the government and the Medellín Cartel traded blows. Not a day went by without a killing. The government was forced to declare martial law to prevent the country from collapsing. They also ramped up extradition, capturing and deporting more than 20 suspected drug traffickers, including Carlos Leda, and even created a 200-man strong national police unit known as the Search Block, with the sole objective of apprehending Escobar. But Pablo had immense resources, and within the first month, more than 30 of the officers had been killed. No one was safe. In 1989, when Luis Garland, a popular politician, was leading the polls in the upcoming election, Pablo had him shot in front of thousands of people during a campaign speech. And then, in an attempt to kill his replacement, Cesar Gaviria, who also supported extradition, Escobar ordered the bombing of Avianca Flight 203, killing 107 people. In response, the government's forces tracked down Jose Gacha at one of his estates, killing him. In the aftermath of the Avianca bombing, Gaviria, who was not on board, rose to prominence on a wave of anti-cartel support and was elected president. And a few days later, under his command, Escobar's cousin and most loyal ally Gustavo was captured and killed by the Search Block. Pablo was devastated and ramped up his attacks. Over the next few years, the cartel detonated hundreds of bombs across the country, targeting police stations, government buildings, and even public neighborhoods, killing hundreds and injuring tens of thousands. The people of Colombia had been under siege for years, and eventually, under immense public pressure, Gaviria's government had no choice but to negotiate with Escobar. In 1991, they agreed to revoke the extradition treaty with the US, and in exchange, Pablo stood down as the leader of the Medellín Cartel and handed himself in for a reduced sentence of only 5 years. And under the condition that he got to keep all of his assets and pick the prison he was sent to. Tired of the bloodshed, the Colombian government agreed. But Escobar had one last trick up his sleeve. Instead of picking one of Colombia's existing prisons, he decided to build his own. In the mountains overlooking the city, Pablo Escobar constructed La Catedral, his own personal prison, where he intended to serve his 5-year sentence. Behind its electrified fence, it may have looked like a normal prison, but inside it was a palace, with luxury rooms, bars, and even a jacuzzi. Pablo staffed the prison with his own men, and for over a year it seemed as if he was complying with the terms of his surrender. But in reality, nothing had changed. Escobar was still very much in control of the Medellín Cartel, and the flow of cocaine to the US remained steady. But as the violence and bombings had stopped, Gaviria and his government were willing to look the other way. This was until news leaked to the media that Escobar had personally killed 4 of his men within the prison. The public was outraged, forcing Gaviria to order an assault on La Cathedral to capture Escobar and his men and transfer them to a real prison. On the 22nd of July 1992, the Colombian army raided the prison, but Escobar was nowhere to be seen. As within his other homes, La Cathedral had escape tunnels, and with his network of informants, Escobar had heard of the raid in advance and fled. From hiding, he attempted to negotiate with Gaviria again, but this time the Colombian government had had enough. While in prison, Escobar's power had been weakened. The Cali cartel, a rival syndicate, had declared war on him. Gaviria had allowed US special forces into the country, and a guerrilla group known as Los Pepes, the people persecuted by Pablo Escobar, emerged and started killing his men across Medellín. Under attack from everywhere, Pablo was cornered. His business was collapsing, his fortune had mostly disappeared, and his most loyal men were dead. And on the 2nd of December 1993, his luck finally ran out, when the CIA intercepted a phone call he was making to his son and pinpointed his location. Within minutes, Escobar was surrounded, and in the shootout that followed, he was killed on the rooftop of his hideout. After years of terrorizing the people of Colombia, Pablo Escobar was finally dead. Over 25,000 people attended his funeral, and even today, he is still remembered for his charity, rather than the ruthless villain he was.